So shifting a little bit, how can we use GIS to sort of fight the power structures that are already in place? So mapping against power structures is something that's called countermapping. And so a good example of this would be efforts to map indigenous spaces, putting indigenous place names on things, mapping outside of the standard colonial narrative. You're using cartography to counter the narrative that has historically been presented. In many cases, this uses participatory data methods, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So some related terms might be public participatory mapping, ethnocartography, or critical cartography. Just to show you some examples of counter mapping, I really suggest everyone check out this site called Decolonial Atlas. They also have an Instagram page. If you follow them on Instagram, there's all sorts of cool stuff on there. I'm a big fan. But so this site is just a collection of a variety of different cartography examples, maps, things that sort of counter some standard narratives. So for instance, this is a map showing police violence with ethnicity overlaid on percent white population census tract. So something similar to what we did in Lab 4. And you can see, for instance, in New York City, how stark everything is and how it lines up. Same for other US cities, right? And so the lack of something like this existing for Canada is what motivated me, for instance, to start working on the police violence project I've been doing. But there's lots of cool stuff on this site. One of the ones I like is Indigenous perspectives. You can click here to see a variety of examples. So for instance, here's a map of Australia showing Indigenous place names. The map is very intentionally showing south as up to counter the sort of prevailing colonial narrative that north is up, because oftentimes people associate up with better. This one's an interesting one, the nearest Indigenous people to Antarctica. So presents a very different narrative to it than the sort of very colonized version of the Antarctic land claims that are out there. This one's pretty interesting. It's showing Mexico City's transit system overlaid on the boundaries of the old lake that used to be there. So shows what the lake's boundaries were in 1519 versus the current satellite imagery of Mexico City, for instance. So this is just a cool resource. I suggest people explore it if you like counter narratives and things like that. So regarding public participation, there's various degrees of public participation that you can have within GIS, and that will sort of govern how involved the individuals are and will impact the end results that you have, and might impact how well received the analysis is. So you can have various degrees of citizen participation, ranging from non-participation to some degree of citizen power. So non-participation would be an analysis is conducted without any sort of consultation of the stakeholders involved, might be coercive, they might try and manipulate the individuals, or they might try and remediate things after the fact, after it's already been done, using therapy, for instance. Moving up from that, you can have various degrees of tokenism where people are consulted, or there's a little bit of, say, informing the public about what's going on, but they don't have very much say in the actual details of the project. They can't veto anything or suggest anything. There's just, basically hand waving and gestures. And so the government, in many circumstances, is often guilty of this, where they'll say they'll consult First Nations on some proposed project, like a pipeline, for instance. But if the nation has a view that is counter to the government's narrative or their predetermined plan, they don't necessarily actually take that into account. They just want to be able to check that box to say they did the consultation, but they're not actually doing any consulting. And so that would be considered tokenism. And then you can have various degrees of citizen power, ranging from partnership to full citizen control. And so this is more where the public is actually actively participating in GIS. So they could partner with the organization to generate the knowledge and do the analysis together, or the citizens can be responsible for the project and just delegate control to the GIS practitioners, or the citizens can have complete control over the analysis and make the decisions with the resulting products. And so there's a variety of different ways and levels with which the public can be involved in a GIS project. And it's really important to think about how that might impact both the final outcome and how it's received. So now I just want to talk about a couple of different forms of participatory GIS. The first thing I want to talk about is called volunteered geographic information, sometimes abbreviated as VGI. And so this is the collection, processing, assembly, and dissemination of geographic data that's provided voluntarily by individuals. Voluntarily does not always mean intentionally. I'm going to show a good example of that in a moment. But basically, this is just data that's put out there by individuals. So a good example would be Twitter posts. You can scrape Twitter if you know a little bit of Python. Twitter has a public API. Anything that is put on Twitter is within the public sphere. You can pull it, create, do anything you want with it. People can use Twitter records, for instance, to map out real-time information about disasters occurring around the world. You could have a code that's set up to constantly scrape Twitter for the word earthquake. And if one individual posts something about an earthquake, maybe it's not indicative of an earthquake. But if there's 5,000 Twitter posts from Mexico City within 15 minutes that all have the word earthquake, then you can use that to identify that there's been an earthquake in Mexico City. And this can apply to a variety of different examples. That's just one. So volunteer geographic information can be used for research, but it's equally likely to be used for commercial purposes as it is for participatory, educational, or other non-commercial uses. So some examples are things like TripAdvisor, Flickr, Twitter. These are all public data sources that can then be used for whatever purpose. And the theory behind it is that there's usually some sort of wisdom in the crowds to validate data. Again, any individual data point isn't necessarily valid, but if you have 5,000 hits from one area at the same time saying the same thing, it's probably because something's happening. And so it's sometimes part of critical or participatory approaches to GIS, and it's sometimes linked with citizen science, but not always. So an example of how volunteer geographic information that's not provided voluntarily can be used is a study from the US. I think it was published in 2015. Yep. Looking at area racism and Black mortality. And so this study measured health outcomes and racism. So the motivation behind this study was that despite the accumulating evidence, a central dilemma of epidemiological studies when looking at racial issues is regarded to the actual measurement of racism. How do you quantify racism? So oftentimes these are based on surveys and things that are self-reported, and self-reporting information is inherently unreliable. People aren't likely to volunteer the information of saying, yes, I am a racist. And so one way that researchers have thought about calculating a proxy for that is using Google searches. So this is a more direct and less biased approach than self-assessment. And so what this study did was it queried Google records based on these media market districts for searches containing the N-word. And it used that as a proxy for area racism, adjusting for some other factors. If you follow the link to the paper, it gives some details specifically about what they did and didn't consider a racist Google search. But they used these Google search records and the relative difference in the number of racist Google searches per media market in the US, and they matched that up with health outcome data. And what this model shows is that areas in red that have sort of a higher above average frequency of racist Google searches have a statistically significant relationship with Black mortality. So essentially, the most racist regions in the United States have a higher mortality rate for Black individuals. And so this is a way that volunteer geographic information can be used to analyze a problem and focus on it in a way that is difficult to do with some more traditional methods in epidemiology, for instance. Moving up from volunteer geographic information, again, that's just information that the public puts out there, regardless of intent, whether it's intentional or not. Volunteer geographic information can be intentional, or it can, again, just be incidental. Citizen science allows volunteers and researchers to team up to address some scientific questions. So here, volunteers provide the legwork of data collection, data cleaning, perhaps initial interpretation of field data. And then it's guided at each step by research experts. And so this participation level can range from simple data collection on through to contributing to academic journals. So an interesting example of this would be something called COCORAS. This is the Community Cooperative Rain, Hail, and Snow Mapping System. And so it's primarily US-centric, but there are also observation locations in Canada. And so what this is it's a cooperative of individuals who have rain gauges in their yards or in their neighborhoods or somewhere nearby. And every day they go out, they check the rain gauge, they report the information to the site. And so, for instance, in Vancouver, in the last day, for instance, someone in my neighborhood got 0.16. I think it's in millimeters. No, they do it in inches because it's a US-based thing. But someone in my neighborhood got 0.16 inches of precipitation. Someone in Port Coquitlam got 0.2, whereas the airport only got 0.13. Point Roberts got 0.1. This provides better spatial resolution than can be collected with, for instance, just the Environment Canada site. So there's a long-term weather station at the airport, but there's less resolution. There's not stations scattered throughout Vancouver. And the network is much denser in the United States. So you can see, for instance, how this can be pretty valuable for collecting high resolution information regarding precipitation. And so this information can be used, for instance, to validate forecast and climate models. Whereas, the official weather records might have one in Seattle, one in Everett, one in Tacoma. You can get high resolution information. It's also very useful for looking at hail and thunderstorm events, which can be very localized. You can see, for instance, all the thunderstorm events occurring in Florida and how patchy they are on a given day. So moving on from citizen science, that's where individuals are involved in some step of it. We have something called participatory GIS. And so this is where the public actually participates in planning and regional development using GIS. And so the end goal of these projects is to make GIS technologies available to the general public in order to enhance their own capabilities to generate, manage, analyze, and communicate spatial information. So the point of this is basically the GIS experts just facilitating and assisting the public in doing their own work and analysis. And so the key point here is that it empowers local groups to do their own GIS work. And so this includes things like the protection of traditional knowledge, wisdom by local Indigenous groups, and helps systematize local spatial knowledge via community mapping and sketch mapping and things like that. So it's really taking the power out of the hands of the GIS practitioners and giving it to the actual stakeholders, the people that are going to be impacted by the GIS work and allowing them to be in control of it themselves. So the primary goal of participatory GIS is the empowerment and inclusion of marginalized people. So these are groups that tend to have little or no voice within the public arena due to some sort of extreme, whether it be location, poverty, racism, sexism, anti-religious feelings, political disempowerment, what have you. And so it often begins through a process of community mapping with many steps and a set of longer term goals for the community. And so this is like a much bigger, more involved project than just querying a little bit of data and making a map on your GIS. You have to go back and forth between the stakeholders and GIS experts. You have to allow the citizens to, contribute their information, to have discussions and conversations, and the GIS practitioner has to accept that their thoughts and feelings on the matter aren't necessarily the ones that actually matter in the circumstance. And they're only there in a role to sort of guide and facilitate rather than to dictate. And so one of the key parts of participatory GIS is community mapping. And so this is having members of a community generate their own data and construct their own maps. You bring members together to share their maps, combine their work into a single community map or an open map that can be shared with the broader public. And then these community efforts can then be coded into a GIS to systematize the community's knowledge, make for a more permanent record of their information, and allow for greater spatial analysis to occur in depth if that's what the community wants. And so one of the I think most impressive examples of this, I talked a little bit about it in week 1, is the Inuit Land Use and Occupancy Project. And so this was a participatory counter-mapping project intended to safeguard Inuit rights to Arctic lands and waters. Basically, the Inuit were becoming increasingly concerned with Southern colonial encroachment onto their lands. And one of the arguments that the government used for encroaching on these lands was that the North was uninhabited. It was this desolate wasteland. Nobody used it for anything, so therefore it was free to be exploited. And so the Inuit Land Use and Occupancy Project aimed to show how that very much wasn't the case. As the Inuit became increasingly concerned about resource extraction, they commissioned a study on their own land use and occupancy of the land. And so they requested outside help from mapping experts, but these experts just facilitated and provided information on how to do these things. And then the community members themselves are the ones that actually created these maps and made this information. And so one of the really impressive things about this study is that it makes no reference to published work other than secondary sources of information or other secondary sources of information. Most of the info that had been published up to this point had been collected, written, and all that created from the Southern perspective by white individuals who worked for the government. And so it was considerably biased towards that perspective. So this project used 100% original data collection from Inuit sources. They had hunters and trappers and people who were familiar with the land create and show maps of their trapping routes. They had people show mark out on maps where various cultural sites were. All the data was collected by the members of the community rather than using information from a biased perspective that was not part of the community. And at the end, this project, it took many, many years to complete, but it was instrumental in the establishment of Nunavut. So it was instrumental in helping the Inuit people become recognized formally, have a self-governing territory of their own. And so it was through this comprehensive multi-year public GIS project that the territory of Nunavut was finally able to be created.